Thank you for joining us today. My name is David Carnes. I'm the Chairman and Chief Evangelist at OpFocus. OpFocus is a consultancy focused on optimizing revenue operations for SaaS companies. In our continuing SaaS RevOps Success webinar series, I couldn't be more excited to focus on today's topic, which is nailing your next acquisition. Bessemer, in their State of the Cloud annual report, talked about over the last 10 years, the 10x increase in investments into private cloud companies. Last year, I think it was around 180 billion that was invested, and the number of private unicorns has doubled in the last couple of years. And part of this is through acquisition, and there's just so much energy. We're seeing this as a big theme for the year 2021. Of just continued focus on acquisition. So we put together today's panel. Prior to jumping into that, I'll just talk about some upcoming OpFocus events that we'd love to have you join us for. Tomorrow, I have a group in our Dashboard Dojo series, digging into report types part 2. We also are very active in sponsoring the Forrester B2B Summit, which will be May 3rd to the 6th. And we have speakers from Seismic and Sirmans joining us. On May 12th, we'll have another Dashboard Dojo, reporting from an end user's perspective. And then on May 18th, the next in the webinar series, the role of a Salesforce architect in scaling SaaS operations. So you can find all these on the events page of the OpFocus site. During today's session, we absolutely welcome your questions. You can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many of the questions as we can during the time. And look forward to trying to provide as much value as we can to you. So today's topic, this nailing your next acquisition. We see so many recent acquisitions, and we are so excited about this panel today, having this group talk about their experiences with recent acquisitions. We'll talk about organizing your staff, preparing for an acquisition. We'll talk about determining what to keep and what you might retire. And this is across systems, data, process, reporting, and other topics. We'll also talk about external factors that impact your work on an acquisition integration. So today we have some really amazing panelists, and I know each of these folks. I've known them for a number of years, and I couldn't be happier to have them join me today. We have Linda Sirmans, who is the Senior Manager for Salesforce projects at Seismic. Seismic is a sales enablement and marketing orchestration platform that improves close rates and delivers large deals for sales teams. So thank you so much for joining us today, Linda. We also have Frank Davis from Emburse. Frank is the Senior Vice President of Commercial and Revenue Operations. Emburse empowers businesses with trusted expense management and AP automation solutions, so they can focus on what matters most. We also have Jim Parker, who's a Senior Growth Advisor on the OpFocus team. Jim and I first met, it might be 10 years ago, working. Jim was an executive at Rocket Software, which was the roll-up of quite a lot of other software companies. And this is probably some of the earliest times that OpFocus worked on these kinds of topics. So glad to have all of you here today. What I'd love to do is ask each of you to start by sharing your most recent acquisition experience. Perhaps, Frank, you might get us started?
Yeah, David, no problem. And thank you very much. So interestingly enough, the Emburse acquisition story is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime story. That's the coming together of some of the greatest brands in modern expense management. We brought together Abacus, Captio, Certify, Chrome River, Nexonia, Tally. Most recently, our new acquisitions, DVI and Roadmap. And so really our mission is to become the preferred choice in the marketplace because we can innovate faster than our competitors, and also because we put the customer at the heart of everything we do. So the idea here is by having this portfolio of world-class solutions, we can really deliver the right solution for the customer, regardless of where they are in their journey. Now, this project originally started back in the beginning of last year when we endeavored to bring our 6 instances of Salesforce together. And we went out and we looked at the marketplace and interviewed 7 different consulting firms, and we selected OpFocus. Now, the original baseline for this project was to be where we were going to engage in what we call a blueprint. So we were going to do an assessment. We were going to build a blueprint and associated project plan. Then we had the idea that we were going to have all of this year to build the design that was put forth in the blueprint, and that we would go live with the consolidated system in January of next year. And then in the fall of last year, we decided to change the go-to-market strategy at Emburse. And this is like a really exciting thing, but it's also a complicating factor that you'll see shortly. So because we wanted to put the customer first and we have these great solutions, we found ourselves in situations where we would have multiple salespeople competing for the same business. So we decided to move to a one Emburse strategy, where now you've got one salesperson that represents Emburse, but they have multiple different solutions from each of those business units that they can sell based on the customer's needs. So essentially at that moment, we said, oh my goodness, how do we do this? Do we build out, CPQ into 6 different systems? Or do we start the consolidation project now and jump into the swimming pool and learn how to swim? So it then in that moment changed the basis of the project from kind of a traditional design build to a more iterative sprint-based approach, where instead of having a year and a half, let's say, we had 3 months to go about doing this. So, and at the same time, we redefined our sales territories, we implemented lean data, marketing decided to consolidate around Marketo, we moved from MQLs to scored MQAs, we standardized on SalesLoft. So not a lot of change took place. So that's kind of the baseline of what I'll talk about today. Is the most recent acquisition experience has been the consolidation, not down from 6 to 1, but our core business, 4 Salesforce instances to 1, 2 that remain, and that we will fold in later this year. David, back to you, sir.
Yeah, so Frank, from that amazing description of what you've been up to, what I focused on is that you actually talked to 7 consulting firms in order to decide to work with us. So that's pretty impressive. I had no idea. So we're so glad to be working with you and your team on that. Linda, how about, would you like to describe your most recent experience?
Sure, mine is nowhere near as exciting as Frank's. In fact, it made me very tired listening to him. But Seismic acquired a complementary product company last year, or actually end of the year before last. And we really didn't begin working on figuring out how to bring all that together until middle of last year. But at the same time, we decided now was a good time to implement CPQ. So we were actually somewhat similar, not quite as broad a scope, juggling 2 major projects at the same time. And the primary impetus for that was because the Percolate Salesforce instance already had CPQ up and running, and we didn't want to take them backwards in time, right? So we were trying with the same set of resources, trying to juggle 2 of those major projects at the same time. And we got it done. It was a lot of coordination, a lot of people working together, dedicated, but definitely a lot of coordination, which is a lot of what we'll talk about today, I think.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Linda. Yep. Jim, can you share your most recent experience?
Sure. I'm certainly glad to be here today. My last 2 experiences have been with Linda and Frank, both of which were great experiences. Still some ongoing on the Emburse side. So let me just mention an earlier experience that I had. This was actually at Rocket Software that you mentioned, David. And basically Rocket Software was a company made up of about 13 or 14 different acquisitions over the course of a few years. But as those acquisitions occurred, those businesses were all allowed to basically run entirely independent of each other without any kind of real integration on a business process side or a technology side. And I joined the company as part of sort of a major initiative to bring all those brands together. So similar to similar to what Frank described, but to bring all those brands together and to begin to generate, some synergy and incremental revenue that having those different brands come together would bring. And so, there's a huge amount of data and technical issues to deal with, but I'd say probably the most challenging piece was all of the sort of the business process optimization and standardization and the resulting change management that was required, because you had businesses that were all being run basically, independently with very different ways of selling and going to market. And so really probably the biggest challenge there was sort of aligning to a single set of business processes and policies and so forth. So, and we had a little more time, thankfully, than we had than Frank and his team and the OpFocus team had with their most recent acquisition. We had more than 3 months to do it, but yeah, fun, exciting, challenging altogether.
Oh, that's great. I remember that very fondly, and I remember hearing about, essentially establishing a corporate layer above those different acquired, merged together companies. And I imagine the whole political structure must be an interesting shift as part of that. So the business makes a decision on a go-to-market strategy, and now across these business units, you have to figure out how do these all fit within that. Why don't we shift to the next topic, which is around organizing your staff for an acquisition. Frank, I know you have a number of thoughts on this particular topic. Maybe you could start us off.
Yeah, David, of course. And, this is actually a really interesting challenge for us, given the situation. And quite honestly, ended up being a little bit of a leap of faith, since we didn't actually have time to do the full discovery and build a project plan ahead of time. So ideally, if we had that project plan ahead of time, it's much easier to understand the work breakdown structure, roles, responsibilities, and then go from there. So really, my suggestion, at least to start, would be to do some capacity planning. In other words, measure the current volume of current, non-project related work that your team is working on. And fortunately, we had a nice revenue operations intake process. We had a good understanding of the amount of tickets that are being generated, the kind of tickets, the amount of work that it would take for us to fulfill those. And obviously look at any critical projects that are currently in flight that you need to manage concurrently or that you need to conclude first. And really, part of it is understanding how are you going to continue to support those inbound requests and maintaining a high level of service to the business at the same time that you're taking on this larger project. And really also in that, looking at or assessing the current resource pool that you have in relation to the project plan, and really identifying any gaps that exist, and then potentially using consulting to bridge those gaps. So like in our case, we were really fortunate that we already had, David, a working relationship with your team. We sort of had the blueprint idea in mind. And for other reasons, we also had a managed service relationship with you that were helping us to move forward with some other things. So essentially, as we realized that, oh my goodness, we need to start like 6 weeks ago or 6 months ago, we need to go, the ability for us to expand the team dynamically and quickly using your resources and Jim Parker and Ahmed and everybody from OpFocus, it's been so great to work with, because we really had a lot of gaps to fill. I also believe, though, too, that defining clear ownership of some of the critical areas in the project, because it's easy to become, sort of crowdsourced. It's easy to become redundant, right, in making decisions, which then kind of robs you of some of the efficiency that you might have in the project, and the old saying of having too many cooks in the kitchen. So I feel like really identifying the path to the executive resource decisions around the desired future state, whether it's just sales or if it's marketing, sales, implementation, BDR, whatever the breadth of the project is, really identifying how those decisions will be made and made quickly. The other thing is identifying somebody or a team to own the data merge and enrichment. So one of the hidden gems, if you want to call it that, of this project for us has been sort of the complication that exists around having disparate data sets that have grown over time for different reasons within these interesting, complex problem to solve. Obviously identifying somebody that understands the sales motion, right? And that could include things like BDR, the marketing motion or demand gen on the front end and how that impacts, and then certainly the service motion as well. Now, we were fortunate in the fact that we were able to sort of bifurcate this project and look to address the Service Cloud separately as an additional kind of wave or sprint. And we were able to really start with Sales Cloud. Last two thoughts are understanding reporting and the analysis, who will be responsible on the team for kind of owning and spearheading that. And then lastly, integration. There were a number of different points of integration that we had as part of this project. That's my 2 cents, David. Back to you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Jim or Linda, do you have anything to add to this, the human element topic?
I love everything Frank said, right? And 2 key points really stuck out for me. One is that capacity planning up front, because I doubt that any of us are sitting around with resources to spare that can just start working on a project of this size. So definitely take some planning, some prioritization to figure out the right people to put on the project. And then integration, big thing, right? We tend to sometimes forget we have all these other SaaS products integrated with Salesforce and how all those things work together. That's a very good point to make. Definitely have to look at that as well, which is separate from, you know, the inner workings of Salesforce. And data, I can't say anything more than that, right? You got to have somebody who's good at data, good, they love it, they live and breathe it. I use this word all the time, geek out on the data, because that's going to make all of that, bringing the data together, the most successful.
I just echo everything Linda and Frank said, and just to pick up on one thing that Frank mentioned, and that is we all have our day jobs, right? We've all have to keep the business moving and respond to our end users in the midst of this acquisition and integration activity. It's really tough to have resources that are trying to do both jobs. So I know maybe sometimes it's a luxury, but if there's any way to sort of dedicate a resource either internally or through consulting or whatever, somebody who's just helping to keep things running, while the SMEs, right, that are part of your team and your extended team within the business can really focus on moving the integration forward. I think that's a big, big impact to efficiency.
Frank, did you have another thought on human element?
Yeah, David, as I heard Linda talking and Jim as well, it really made me think of the sort of the people side of the equation. And, just a few things that I would point out and the day job component that just came up, right? And don't underestimate the amount of increase in workload that's going to be well over and above, the day-to-day working. And so the concern is that, due to timeframes being short, due to the increase in work, due to the desire to move too quickly, you can risk burning out members of your team for sure, right? And so I think it's really important to discuss ahead of time, obviously, the goals of the consolidation, the time frame, the resource constraints, right? And try not to divorce the time frame from the actual work that's to be performed, right? So we sort of ended up having to move in a direction where we had to hit a deliverable so that we could get the sales team ready to be able to sell these multiple solutions to really add that additional value to the customer. But the end result was that it didn't really line up with a project plan per se, because we would have said it would have taken us longer. So that causes stress, it causes long nights and weekends to be worked. And so I feel like the last point is, even if you pull off like an on time, on budget, flawlessly executed project, that a lot of the work is also transparent to some degree to your end users, right? They were using a system before, they're using a system now, it looks a little bit different, right?
Right.
So I also feel like just recognizing the team, right, as the unsung heroes that, are part of the revenue engine that can support that new post-acquisition paradigm and can deliver the kind of efficiency and scalability and revenue growth that the organization really demands and is looking for, right, as part of that consolidation. So the point being is, there's a lot of people to thank, that are doing work behind the scenes, and make sure you find out ways to do that and to really herald their accomplishments during the project, because it's easy to focus on, hey, what went wrong? Like, why is this not working right? Like, that's something that'll come naturally, right? So you want to make sure that you can really be proactive and focus on the great work that's being done.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Did you have another thought?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I totally agree, Frank, because the fact that it goes off well doesn't mean it wasn't hard and complex. It means you had a rockstar team working on it to get it done.
Yeah, I suppose one last thought to add on this. I've been teaching Salesforce administration for years, and for years I've said there are 2 things that I think people, most of the topics I think are very learnable. We can learn, but two topics. I think it's really helpful to have outside help to help people get beyond the day job piece, but this is also a very intense activity. Just so much thought going into this. The two things are CPQ implementations. It's an advanced thing, and then tech stack merges. It's just an advanced topic, and having folks that have done it before can certainly be helpful. Let's shift gears and let's talk about preparing for an acquisition. Linda, perhaps you could lead us off on talking about how you should go about preparing for an acquisition.
Yeah, I started thinking about, how do I explain this to other people, right? Because I've done this a few times. And I think there are 5 main areas you kind of have to realize you need to address as you start into this initiative. You've got your business process, you've got your Salesforce system functionality, you've got all those integrations of tools and other platforms. You've got your data. That's a huge chunk of what you've got to think about. And you've also then got your user access to everything that you're bringing together. You've got people who are used to working in all these other places, and they now have to be moved into a new consolidated Salesforce and or other tools. So I kind of thought that's where you start, right? Like, these are the areas you have to think about. And then as you start to think about organizing around that work, I've got just some key components that you need. And I mean, it's a big project. So if you've done project management of this size, software development projects, none of this will be very new to you, but I can't stress enough how important all of these pieces are, and not only doing these pieces, but having good, clear documentation and communication around them. You've got your project planning and how you manage the whole project. You need to keep track of risks, assumptions, open issues, and decisions. And a commonly used tool for doing that in project management is RAID logs. It's super, super important. I don't care how many people you've got working on it. I don't care how smart you are. You're not going to remember every detail of every conversation that happens during this project. And that's going to be critical to not only remembering what the decision was, but in many cases, why. You're gathering requirements, like you're assessing business differences, you're assessing system differences, and you're trying to figure out how to bring all that together. You need to capture what are the ultimate goals, the requirements of the system, the requirements of processes, and make sure everybody is aligned to that. Your field mapping, field data decisions, right? That is probably the biggest, hardest, most complex, most detail-oriented piece of what you've got to do here. And it's not easy, it's tedious, and you need the right person on that job. I can't stress that enough, because you're looking at every piece of data between the systems you're trying to bring together to decide what to do with them, what goes where, what are the field values the same, do you need to keep it, can you get rid of it? Testing, we all know testing in software development cycles, right? You need your build to be tested, whether it's admin configuration, code changes, what have you, that needs to be tested. And I highly recommend that you get your users into an environment as well. They're going to be the ones that notice the odd things that you just don't know because you don't do their job. Implementation plan. Don't wait till the week before you go on live to figure out what you're doing to go live. As you're working through all of these processes of building and testing, field data mapping, you should be doing all kinds of practice runs, right? Practice runs will help you get your timing down. It'll help you make sure you've got your steps in the right order. All that should be very well documented. So when you get to go live weekend or week or however long that takes, you're just following a recipe. You're gonna have things crop up you didn't expect. It always happens, but if you've got your recipe to follow, everything that you do know is gonna go very smoothly. Your go live, obviously, that's the big kick, right? However long that's gonna take, weekends, nights, weekends, whatever you plan for, you gotta think about how you get that done, what systems have to be down while you're doing it, people not allowed to be in systems, who's doing what work, people have to sleep, they can't function on no sleep. And then throughout the whole process, throughout the entire project, communication and status updates to all your stakeholders, all the people involved in the project, it's so super critical. And I'll stop because I could keep going, but I'll stop there and let everybody else have a
So
word.
many great ideas. Thank you, Linda. Jim, do you have other thoughts to add on this topic?
I mean, Linda was the perfect one to talk through that planning because she's a real expert at doing that. We talk about sort of like the three-legged stool, right? You take out any one of those legs and the whole thing falls over. There's really, to Linda's point, doing an acquisition well, doing an acquisition integration well really requires all 5 of those legs on that stool. And I noticed there was a question in the Q&A about, well, are there risks to extending out the timeline, right? If you've got limited resources who can't devote all their time to an integration, are there risks to sort of stretching out the timeline in order so they can sort of wear multiple hats? And I'd say the greater risk is trying to do it the other way, right? The greater risk is forcing a unrealistic timeline and not doing the things that Linda described really well. So if you have to choose, I would err on extend out your timeline, take the time you need to do it right, so that it goes off smoothly at the end. Much better option than trying to. I mean, sometimes you're just forced. You're forced with a particular deadline, but whenever possible. And I think Frank made the same point. Like, build your timeline in a way that allows you to do things right.
Yeah, absolutely. Let the project plan determine a time frame, right, based on what your goals and deliverables are, versus just saying we need to be live by a certain date and backing into that, right? So that's definitely the case. I love everything that Linda said, and I think I wouldn't reiterate any of it because I think it was spot on. I would just add a couple of things just that we observed, right? So in bringing together these different businesses, part of what I think that I tried to do in this is working with the executive team to understand really what is our desired future state, right? In other words, you're doing one thing over here, you're doing another thing over there. In our case, we brought 4 different sales forces together. But with the Emburse story, by us coming together, the whole is truly greater than the sum of the parts, right? So it's kind of like, are we going to necessarily do what we were doing before? Or are we going to do something different and better because we aspire to grow and be a different company? So it comes down to kind of aligning the strategic direction and strategy of the company and of the business with what it is that you're trying to pull through your systems, right? So for us, it was definitely about the customer's journey, right? And being able to really put them first. It was also partially in that vein, to be able to, not just recommend something because that was the one solution that you sold, but to recommend the right thing. And then also to understand for them what their journey looks like and be able to provide them with the additional products and services that allow them to grow towards being a world-class organization as it relates to expense management. So what that means in our case was, well, how do we make sure that, the bundling that needs to take place in CPQ is proper such that it supports that journey, or that the, managed services that go with the actual software services that we deploy, that those are properly recommended for the right reasons, right? And then those things work together. But also then obviously pulling that all the way through to things like the reporting and the analytics and the forecasting around that, So we have so many new go-to-market ideas because we're innovating constantly. Part of it was understanding what's the framework, the better framework to understand, like, are we making progress against those goals? So I would just say, again, it's understanding desired future state and making sure that whatever you're building reflects that or supports that. And that's my 2 cents.
All right, that's great. And just thinking about our next topic, and this is such an important one, right? So the private equity firm that's funding you comes to you, lets you know, or your colleagues leading your company let you know there's a new acquisition on the horizon. You start digging into their tech stack, their systems, their reality with data and reporting and process. How do you determine what to keep and what to retire as part of this acquisition integration process? Jim, perhaps you could start us with that.
Sure. This is such an important question, and maybe before I offer a couple of suggestions, maybe just a I guess a gentle reminder that really an acquisition sort of creates a natural opportunity for improvement across the business, right? So you've got to get the acquisition done, but this is all, it opens up an opportunity to make improvements outside of just, bringing on another business. So that means like all functions, right? All processes, all systems, all data, as well as the people that are involved in those things. It's a great time to to take a holistic view of those things and make improvements, wherever they're needed. So there's a couple of techniques that I think have been very helpful. We actually used this in the acquisition of Percolate at Seismic, where we started with basically identifying the most important processes to sort of get right, or the ones that most need improvement. So obviously you're going to have to address, as part of the acquisition, like every business process that touches Salesforce or touches your customer facing functions. But it's helpful to maybe pick like the 5 or 10 that are most critical to the purposes and the objectives of the integration. And then list those out, right? Maybe for you, it's lead management has to be really, really good. Or maybe it's, we've got to get the contracting process smooth, or we have to make sure that forecasting comes off successfully. So pick those like 5 to 10 processes, make a list of them, make them like a matrix, and then get the right leadership and SMEs from both organizations together, and go through basically just a side-by-side, call it a business process audit or a business process assessment, right? And there's like 4 or 5 different criteria to consider as you kind of walk through, have each team basically describe and walk through, and ideally show a little bit of show and tell, right, how that process is managed in their team. So, and as you go through that process, ask yourself a few questions. So here's sort of the common criteria that we use. The first is like, how effective is the process in driving the behaviors that we need, in producing the results that we need, in maximizing, right, maximizing revenue, maximizing growth, new logos, whatever, customer satisfaction, whatever those key metrics are. How effective is the process at each of the organizations at driving those right behaviors and key metrics? And maybe include in that as well, like how well does the process capture the information that we need to grow and to manage the business effectively? Okay, so that's for like evaluation criteria number 1. The second one is how mature or efficient, right, are our processes, are each of those processes. And by that, you may have a very effective process, right, that drives the right behavior and gets you the right data, but it's super manual, right, or it's very inefficient. So the second question is really like how sophisticated, how automated, how scalable are the various processes that we're running, how much manual work is required, and will what we're doing today allow us to easily sort of grow and adapt in the future, right? A lot of the companies that we work with, acquisition, as you mentioned, David, is part of the growth plan. And so we need to ensure that the processes we're putting in place are going to allow us to easily bring, new acquisitions on board and to scale. That's like criteria number 2. Criteria number 3 is data quality, right? So how complete, how accurate, how meaningful or valuable is the data that gets produced or that exists in the 2 orgs or the 2 objects, whatever you're comparing, and how well is that data going to meet our future business needs? As Linda talked about, like you're going to have to go through a consolidation process, a very detailed consolidation process on a data level. And how can we make sure that we're structuring our data in a way that it's most will support our growth plans. The fourth one is adoption. So ask yourself, how well are the 2 processes, the various processes used? How user friendly are they? Are our people actually using the process as designed, or are they using workarounds or manual kludges or whatever to do the process? And then lastly, like the last question, right? The focus of those first 4 or 5 is like really around business process. And the last one is, okay, what technologies are we using to support those processes? And are those technologies, sort of best in class? Are we using Excel to do stuff, or are we using, sort of best in class tools, to support the process, to streamline the process? So I think going through that process will naturally sort of bubble up to the top the areas that you want to keep from each of the businesses. So typically, right, when you go through a process like this, both organizations have some really good stuff that you want to keep, and they both have areas where they can be improved. And so you tend to have like a hybrid solution at the end, where you've taken the best of both, and you've incrementally improved perhaps a process that wasn't as efficient on either side to begin with. So just a few ideas there.
Oh, and that's great. And this, thought of to the victor goes the spoils, and the acquiring company is the only way or the highway, sort of, that may not be the best approach. And what we want is a set of systems, data, and process that can scale to that next level of growth that the company is aiming for at the end. Frank or Linda, do you have thoughts to add on this topic?
I walked through that exact process Jim just described, a little over a year and a half ago. And I, speaking from experience, it worked, right? We got all the right people in the room. We compared one Salesforce system and business processes to another. We had the RevOps leads involved. And we came out of that knowing roughly kind of the size of what we were looking at, right? And then from there, you start to dig into the weeds. So it's all, you've got to just take it step by step, start with your goals, figure out your people and who's going to be part of that, get your high level assessment done. That'll give you an idea of how big this thing is, and then start building out the full project plan and details and work tasks and what have you.
I would agree with that. I think, that is the ideal approach if possible, right? That's obviously the preferred approach. If not, I think it's interesting how, if you're forced to move more quickly and don't have the opportunity to always do that, it becomes almost building, small scrum teams about understanding, okay, how do we prioritize the things that we're trying to move through as it related to this project? How do we make good decisions quickly versus making perfect decisions slowly, right? It's kind of like there's always that trade-off a little bit. David, I would just point out too, we're starting to get some really heavy thunder, lightning, and so forth here in New Jersey. So if all of a sudden you hear see a big shiny zap and I'm not here anymore, just know that.
Oh, likely excuse, Frank. That's great. All right, let's move on to the next question before Frank gets zapped. What external factors impacted the integration effort, so merging the tech stacks? Perhaps, Frank, you could start us off with this before you disappear.
Yeah, no problem. So I think, the biggest certainly was just the time frame, right? Was the single biggest factor that influenced everything, right? So it wasn't kind of like, hey, we've got this wonderful understanding of what it is we need to do. We've got the team mapped out, we've got all the right resources, we've got this much time. Now we're going to say, let's go ahead and do that. So I think the time frame was part of the biggest complicating factor. But the other thing, though, that I think is the takeaway for me, hopefully for the audience as well, is be mindful around the sum total of change that you're trying to invoke across all of the different departments that might be impacted in terms of the endeavor that you're aspiring to complete. Because whereas it may seem like, okay, well, these folks want these few things, and the next department, partners wants these things, and marketing wants these things. It's the sum total, I think, of the amount of change that also was very impactful, and was what I would consider an external factor. So like some examples, we talked about consolidating data from 4 different instances of Salesforce. However, the way the data had been used historically was very different. So some of the other businesses were more like round robin distribution of inbound leads, and they really didn't enrich the data until it became something. Whereas the enterprise business was very discrete in territories and the way that things were assigned. So there was a lot of data enrichment. And it's like, okay, we've got sort of a mixed bag of things here. How do we deal with that? We also, created a new kind of a model around account scoring and focus accounts that outside of that, for some of the business segments, right, there was round robin distribution. We added some complication to the sales territories. Things like, some teams got pure round robin. Some teams got focus accounts with round robin. Some had assigned territories. Some have assigned verticals. Some have named strategic accounts, right? So those changes also added to some of the complication. I think I mentioned previously, we moved from kind of an event-driven, marketing qualified lead model to more of a score-based marketing qualified account model. Lots of change there, right? And ways we do things for all the right reasons, right? Absolutely the right thing to do, but it was external complications that were added. Last 2 points, you mentioned CPQ. CPQ should not be taken lightly. There's a lot of work to do there. In addition, because of our coming together, we're implementing in parallel a contract lifecycle management solution, so Conga, right? So understanding that not only are we doing a consolidated CPQ, we only had one business unit using CPQ previously. Now we're bringing everybody into CPQ, but to really do things the right way, we're leveraging Conga. We will be leveraging Conga in the short term. That added some complications. And then last point, just not only sales restructure, but other departmental restructure, like the CSM team, again, for the right reasons. And that's where it comes down to understanding what is the overall business strategy? What are we trying to do to improve the business? What are those changes tactically that have been made to support the strategy? And then how do we support those things? Again, change was kind of like the constant, if you will.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Frank. Linda, do you want to speak on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to piggyback a little bit on some of what Frank said and a little bit of back to Jim's prior information. As you're thinking about all the things you need to improve and can improve, it can sometimes get to a point where everybody just wants to go ahead and make all the improvements they ever wanted now. And so you really also need a strong executive stakeholder that can say, that's not critical to the success of this consolidation. We'll do that after, and not let every possible improvement that could come through actually get into this project. There's really a fine line there between opening the hood and making some improvements while you're there versus this really can wait. And that will help reduce kind of your risk to the overall project timeline and quality and everything, just by helping to manage that. I also wanted to mention, by the way, one thing that for me was quite different in the most recent acquisition integration project, right, was the whole impact. We all are probably tired of talking about it, right? But COVID last year, right? You couldn't get all these people making all these decisions into a room for a week and get through it, quickly. It required a lot more finesse and coordination and Zoom meetings. And we all know what Zoom meeting fatigue does to us. But more importantly for me, the biggest change I saw was really on our go live weekend. We couldn't have everybody that was a critical team member of the go live come and be in all in one war room working together, right? Everybody was in a different location, and we had to really think differently about coordinating those people throughout the weekend and how we keep tabs on progress throughout the weekend. And it was just a different experience for me for that. I just wanted to kind of call that out because that was something we had to learn how to adjust to last year.
Yeah, that's great. I was wondering if coronavirus would come up and just sort of some of the interesting realities, like some clients' revenue went to zero for a period of time, and other clients' revenue went through the roof because their industries were benefited, but that had really interesting impacts on these integration projects, availability of resources. I can see that decision maker. We need people to make decisions for these types of projects to be successful. And it's such an important topic. Jim, did you have anything else that you'd like to share on this?
Just maybe to echo that change is the one constant, right? So the best laid plans, right? So just assume going into it that you're gonna need to change your plans somewhere during the acquisition process. So.
Great. All right, let's shift gears one more time. Biggest lesson learned from all this work, all this integration time. What's your one biggest lesson learned to share with the folks on the webinar today? Jim, would you start us off with this?
Sure, you bet. And it's interesting, just for the audience's benefit, like we didn't coordinate any of our answers here, but it's cool to see like the themes and the similarities in some of the thoughts here. And so my biggest lesson learned actually touches on some stuff that was mentioned earlier, and that is to really anchor yourself in the business objectives for the integration, right? There was a reason why, management decided to acquire this company or to bring these businesses together. So spend your time focusing on the things that impact those goals and avoid getting sidetracked or spinning your wheels on things that don't really matter or that matter, but like Linda said, can wait, right? So, I mean, typically the focus is going to be on things like shortening the time to ROI, right? Or shortening the time when we're actually driving incremental revenue, or shortening the time when we're maximizing the synergies between the two businesses. And there's going to be a myriad of questions and issues that you have to deal with as part of this acquisition process. But in every case, like, ask yourself, is this critical to achieving the most important objectives? And if the answer is yes, then spend the time to do that well. And if not, set it aside and work on it as part of like a phase 2 integration.
Oh, that's such good advice. Linda, do you have a biggest lesson learned to share?
Yeah, I think it's about, I love what Jim and Frank have both said, but also starting that process of figuring out what your goals are and getting everyone organized around that quickly and not letting it drag out. For a variety of reasons, our last acquisition integration, we didn't really get started focusing in on the actual integration project for 6 or 7 months after. And we came through in the end, obviously, but what it meant is we had a lot of different business teams who were already starting to try to figure out how do they function. They already needed to make process changes and or possibly system changes before we had even begun to gather all of that decision making about the ultimate goals and who's going to do it and getting everybody aligned and on the same path. And I think that contributes to a little bit of rework here or there, or one hand not knowing what the other hand's doing sometimes. So I would just say, get that alignment kickoff of the project started early. As soon as you can, get all the people aligned, the goals decided, and don't let it drag out because the business keeps going.
Oh, that's great. Great advice. Frank?
Yeah, so I actually read the question to be biggest lessons with an S in plural learned. So I have a couple of them here actually, but I promise to move quickly. So just thinking about, the journey that we've been on, right? And David, your team has been fantastic with us being on this journey. Just thinking of some of the things that, in hindsight, right, being 2020, I think the first would be really investing significant time into understanding the data. And I know we did this, but I don't think you can overdo it, right? And the normalization of the data. In our case, the need for enrichment of the data. Most importantly, don't underestimate the impact of duplicate data that it would have on your team, right? It creates confusion, it creates concern. You certainly don't want to have, situations where an account was a customer for one business unit and, is a prospect for another, and now we're prospecting into our customers. Not that that stuff happened, it didn't, but we want to make sure that those are things we don't do. I think another recommendation or lesson learned would be making sure you involve the enablement team to the extent that you can in change management, right? Because there's a lot of change. So Linda brought this up earlier. You're moving people's cheese. Like they were used to using one system before and doing things a certain way before. Now they're doing it a different way. So we want to make sure that we can leverage folks like the enablement team to really help that process be as fluid as we can be. Over communicate. And in some cases, even draw people in, right? Because there's all those conversations that happen, as course of planning and doing business that, not everybody's aware of everything, right? So trying to create an environment of collaboration and communication and really drawing out the details that you need not assuming that you have the information that you need at your fingertips, I think is another big one. Last two, but they're simple. Don't let the project plan determine the go live date, or excuse me, let the project plan determine the go live date, and don't attempt too much change at once. You know, if you can do those things, then those are things to aspire to.
Oh,
And
that's
I would,
great.
I would
Okay.
just throw in another last one. Take care of your people. I know we talked about that a lot at the beginning, but that is so super important.
Oh, that's great. All right. So just to reiterate, we have more events coming up like this one. Tomorrow we have a dashboard dojo. We'll be doing a hands-on session on report types. In May, we'll be participating in the Forrester B2B Summit. We'll be sponsoring and have a number of sessions, including ones from Seismic and SizeSense. We have another dashboard dojo coming up on May 12th, and that's open to anyone who wants to participate, reporting from an end user's perspective. And then we'll be back in the webinar format on May 18th for the role of a Salesforce architect in scaling SaaS operations. We do welcome your questions. If you want to drop them into the Q&A, we'll get to them in just 1 second. I do want to say thank you to everyone for being part of this session, and thank you to Frank and Linda and Jim for sharing the wisdom today. Why don't we dive into questions? And I see that we have one here. How do you help the executive sponsors understand how much work goes into the day-to-day work of the tech stack merge? So how do we inform the executive sponsors and make sure they understand how much goes into these processes? Anyone have thoughts to share?
Yeah, I have a quick thought, and it's a great question, and it is something that I think that it's easy, and I think we were very fortunate given the ELT that we have at Emburse, but it's easy to become a little bit disconnected and not have executive leadership know exactly how much work is going into a project like this, because it can be Herculean. So we have a weekly ELT call that I think has been helpful in being able to showcase some of the weekly progress. But I also think getting back to the over communication, sort of summarizing, I think like a sort of a weekly update to the executives as to here's the kind of things that we accomplished this week. Here's the problems that we solved. Here's the things we did proactively. Here's the things that are on the list for the coming weeks or coming month. I think it's just fair to say that you can't over communicate enough in these situations.
Great. Jim or Linda?
I second what Frank is saying. It's important to have someone keeping your ELT, up to date with what's going on. There is sometimes decisions they have to make in order for us to progress. That over communicate, absolutely. That it's like documentation. They're both 4-letter words sometimes, and we don't do enough of it. And when we are forced into a tight timeline, those are the things we usually don't do well before and above everything else. So, everything's just going to be much more successful if you're doing those things. Have someone that's, usually your project manager, right? They're the ones who are going to be communicating most of those status updates. So make sure you have someone dedicated to that role. Managing a project like this shouldn't be a second or third or fourth hat that somebody's wearing. That should be their only hat.
Yeah, it sounds so important. Jim, any thoughts?
I read that question slightly differently, so maybe I'll answer it from that perspective as well. I read it as how do I help the executive sponsor sort of understand how much day-to-day work there is going on? And I think the answer, if that was the question, I'll answer it from that perspective. And I think the answer is like data is your best friend, right? So if you don't currently have a way of tracking, what the RevOps team or the Salesforce team is doing on a day-to-day basis, like talk to us. We can give you some simple suggestions and ideas for how you can track that, whether you use cases or whether you use a custom object or whatever. But start keeping track of all the work that your team is doing, so that then you can provide a data-based answer to the question of why can't we just take on this acquisition with our existing resources?
That's super important.
Yeah.
I was able to do some analysis for last year, and I showed that my primary system admin went from handling 400 requests all of last year to already at 700, just what, fourth month of this year, right? It's super important, not only for assessing with a project like this, but just in general to know how you're staffed and how you're going to get things done.
All right, so we have one last question for the group. This is from my good friend Kimberly, who said, when you have multiple items integrated with Salesforce, I'm imagining these are things like Seismic or other third-party tools integrated with Salesforce. Do you recommend evaluating how the Salesforce instances will be combined, or does it make sense? Does it make any sense to review external systems such as telephony, email servers, enrichment tools first? In other words, if you know which marketing automation tool will be used, does it make the decisions on the process evaluation smoother?
That's not an easy question to answer. And I love that you mentioned marketing automation tool, because that's another big one usually in use and integrated with Salesforce. And it gets to be really challenging if you've got, one Salesforce connected to Marketo and one Salesforce connected to Pardot, and the marketing team wants to use Marketo, but you really thought this Salesforce connected to Pardot was the right one to go with. Now you've got a dilemma that's not easy to decide. There's no quick answer to that. You really just have to weigh, the work between, do you reconnect Marketo to a different Salesforce instance, which by the way is not that easy to do, I understand, or do you keep the existing Salesforce instance in Marketo and now you bring everything that you need for the go forward into the Salesforce instance? It's really going to take looking at what's going on between all of those integrations to figure out the best way to go forward. And there's no easy answer. We've even, discussed in the last acquisition, we have this instance and this instance, or do we go do we go to a brand new Salesforce instance? A lot of people always want to think that's easier to do because you're starting with a clean slate. But when you've got a Salesforce system that's as integrated as we tend to be these days, that's not such a simple answer. And I don't think I gave an answer really, just that it's hard work to figure out how to make that decision. There's a lot of analysis has to go into it.
Thank you so much. And I know Frank has a last word we'll share before wrapping up.
Yeah, no, David, just real quick. I mean, so you may recall that we codenamed the project Amazon because the Amazon River has the largest number of tributaries of any river in the world. And so, at Emburse, we had a little bit of everything, right? We literally had HubSpot, Pardot, Marketo, we had SalesOff, we had Outreach, we had, you name it, we had it, right? And so I think at least our general set of principles were to identify, again, what's our ideal future state? What do we want to be doing? What tool best supports that? And then look at, are there any limitations, showstoppers, or technical integration challenges that cannot properly be overcome in the context of the project? So we kind of let the desire of what we wanted to accomplish drive us to select the best tool, and then make sure that there were no limitations that would prevent us from using the tool properly in the consolidated instance. That's how we approached it.
Well, thank you so much to Frank Davis of Emburse, Linda Sirmans of Seismic, and Jim Parker of the OpFocus team. Kyle, thank you so much for hosting us again. We hope you'll join us at one of the next events that we're hosting. And again, to our panelists today, we so appreciate you sharing your experiences with everyone on the call today.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here.
Thank you.
Great seeing you.